The sun was just beginning to rise as Sophie stood in front of her small cafe, taking a deep breath. The sign above the door gleamed in the soft morning light, Sophie's Place, a name she had chosen with care, hoping it would feel warm and welcoming. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the open doorway, mixing with the crisp morning air. Today was a big day. It was the cafe's grand opening. She had dreamed of this moment for years. Every detail, from the wooden tables to the cozy armchairs, had been carefully chosen. But as much as she had prepared, one thing still made her nervous speaking English with customers. Her cafe was in a busy part of town, attracting tourists from all over the world. While she could understand English fairly well, speaking it fluently was another challenge. Sophie adjusted her apron and walked behind the counter, double-checking that everything was ready. The espresso machine hummed. A tray of croissants sat neatly by the register, and a chalkboard menu displayed the drinks she had practiced saying out loud. Coffee, tea, pastries. She repeated the words under her breath, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of a ceramic cup. You can do this. Just be polite and smile, she told herself. The bell above the door jingled. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Her first customer had arrived. A tall man with a kind smile walked up to the counter. He was clearly a tourist, dressed casually with a backpack slung over his shoulder. Sophie swallowed her nerves and greeted him with the best English she could manage. "Hello, welcome," she said, her voice a little higher than usual. The man smiled back. "Hi, can I have a coffee, please?" Sophie hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Yes, one coffee." She reached for a cup and turned toward the espresso machine. Her hands moved automatically, measuring the grounds, tamping them down, pressing the button. The comforting sound of espresso dripping into the cup helped steady her nerves. She turned back, carefully placing the steaming cup in front of him. "Here, your coffee," the man beamed. "Thank you." Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "I did it. I spoke English, and he understood me." As the man sipped his coffee, another customer walked in, a woman with sunglasses and a camera hanging around her neck. She smiled at Sophie and glanced at the menu. "Good morning," Sophie greeted her, feeling a little more confident now. "Good morning," the woman replied. "What do you recommend?" Sophie froze for a second. "Recommend?" She recognized the word but struggled to find the right response. Her mind raced. What should she say? The woman noticed her hesitation and tried again. "What is your favorite?" Relief washed over Sophie. "Ah, she's asking what I like. I like cappuccino," Sophie said, smiling. "It is very good. Great. I'll have one then," the woman said cheerfully. Sophie prepared the cappuccino, carefully, focusing on every step. As she handed it to the woman, she felt a tiny spark of pride. She was speaking English slowly, maybe not perfectly, but enough to serve her customers. More people began to enter, and soon Sophie found herself taking orders. answering simple questions and learning new words as she went. Every thank you and you're welcome felt like a small victory. By noon, the cafe was buzzing with customers. Some sat by the windows, enjoying their drinks, while others lined up at the counter. Sophie barely had time to think about her nerves anymore. She was too busy making coffee, smiling at customers, and repeating words she had just learned. As she wiped down the counter during a brief lull, she felt a wave of happiness. The cafe was open. People were enjoying it. And she was learning. Then the bell jingled again. Another customer entered, but this time he looked a little different from the others. He seemed unsure, hesitating at the entrance before stepping inside. Sophie noticed his curious gaze scanning the cafe. She straightened up and smiled. "Hello, welcome." The man returned the smile and walked toward the counter. But instead of ordering immediately, he glanced at the menu, then back at her. "Do you have, He paused, searching for the right words. "A special coffee?" Sophie's heart raced. "A special coffee? What does he mean?" And just like that, she faced her next challenge, understanding a customer's request beyond the simple "Can I have a coffee?" Sophie felt her pulse quicken as she tried to process the man's request. A special coffee? What does that mean? She glanced at the menu, hoping for a clue. Coffee, tea, cappuccino, espresso. Everything seemed ordinary. Did he mean something not listed? She looked back at him, offering a hesitant smile. "A special coffee?" she repeated, buying herself time. The man, who had short, curly hair and an easygoing demeanor, nodded. "Yes, something different? Something you recommend?" There it was again, recommend. Sophie had just struggled with that word earlier. This time she was determined to answer confidently. She took a breath. "Yes, I have." She paused, searching for the right words. "A latte. With cinnamon. It is sweet and warm." The man's face lit up. "That sounds great. I'll take one." Relieved, Sophie turned to prepare the drink. As she steamed the milk, she thought about how small victories like this helped her confidence grow. Just this morning, she had frozen at the word recommend, and now she had used it in conversation. She carefully poured the latte into a cup, sprinkling a dash of cinnamon on top before setting it on the counter. "Here is your special coffee," she grinned. The man took a sip and nodded approvingly. "This is really good." "Thank you." Sophie let out a small sigh of relief. "You're welcome." As he found a seat near the window, the bell jingled again, and a couple entered. They seemed to be tourists as well, speaking softly in English while looking at the menu. Sophie watched them, preparing herself for the next conversation. The woman approached the counter first. "Hi, we'd like 2 coffees, please." Sophie smiled. "Yes, 2 coffees." The woman hesitated, then added, "Oh, and do you have any pastries?" Sophie's mind raced. Pastries. Pastries. What does that mean? She looked at the display case. where croissants, muffins, and small cakes were neatly arranged. Then it clicked pastries, meant baked goods. Yes, she said, pointing at the case. Here, croissant, muffin, cake. The woman and her partner looked at the selection, whispering to each other. Oh, that looks good. Maybe a croissant? The man said. Sophie seized the opportunity. You like croissant? Yes. The woman replied with a smile. One croissant, please. Sophie nodded, feeling another wave of triumph. She had learned a new word and used it immediately. As she placed the croissant on a small plate, the woman spoke again. Your English is really good. Sophie's eyes widened slightly. Oh, no. Not good, she said with a nervous laugh. The woman shook her head. No, really. You're doing great. Sophie felt warmth spread through her chest. Compliments weren't something she expected, but they gave her a little boost of confidence. After handing them their order and thanking them, Sophie returned behind the counter, her mind still replaying the conversation. Pastries, recommend, special coffee. She was learning more with every interaction. The afternoon passed quickly, and Sophie continued practicing her English with each customer. Some spoke slowly, some quickly, but every order was a new lesson. Just as she was cleaning up a spill near the register, she heard a familiar voice. Excuse me. She turned to see the man who had ordered the special coffee standing at the counter again. His cup was empty, and he looked impressed. I just wanted to say, this was one of the best lattes I've ever had, he said. I'll definitely come back. Sophie's heart swelled. Oh, thank you, he grinned. And what's your name? She wiped her hands on her apron. I'm Sophie. Well, Sophie, I'm Daniel. And I'll be back for another special coffee soon. He gave her a small wave before heading out the door. As the bell jingled behind him, Sophie smiled to herself. I did it. I really did it. She wasn't just learning English. She was building something, a connection with people, one cup at a time, and she couldn't wait for what the next day would bring. The next morning, Sophie arrived early at the cafe, feeling a little more confident than the day before. She had handled simple conversations, learned new words, and even received a compliment on her English. But she knew she still had a long way to go. As she arranged the pastries in the display case, she thought about Daniel, the friendly customer from yesterday. Would he come back today? She hoped so. Speaking with him had felt natural, almost easy. The bell jingled, pulling her out of her thoughts. A new customer entered, a young woman with headphones around her neck, scrolling through her phone. She approached the counter without looking up. Hey, can I get a double-shot oat milk latte with light foam and a pump of vanilla? Sophie blinked. A what? She had understood latte and vanilla, but the rest felt like a blur. She smiled politely. Sorry, again? The woman looked up, a little impatient. A double-shot oat milk latte, light foam, 1 pump of vanilla. Sophie's heart pounded. She repeated the words in her head, trying to break them down. Double shot? 2 espresso shots. Oat milk? Okay. Milk. Light foam, little foam, and vanilla. She took a breath. Yes. Latte with 2 espresso, oat milk, little foam. Vanilla? The woman nodded. Yeah, exactly. Relieved, Sophie moved quickly to the espresso machine. She had never made this exact drink before, but she knew the basics. She pulled 2 shots of espresso, steamed the oat milk carefully, and added a little foam. Then she hesitated. How much vanilla is 1 pump? Not wanting to make a mistake, she grabbed the syrup bottle and poured a small amount, hopefully enough. She placed the drink on the counter. Here is your latte. The woman picked up the cup, took a sip, and paused. Sophie held her breath. After a moment, the woman gave a small nod. Yeah, this is good. Thanks. Then she put her headphones back on and walked out. Sophie exhaled in relief. I did it. It wasn't perfect, but she had understood and made the drink correctly. The bell jingled again. This time, a familiar face appeared. Daniel. Morning, Sophie, he said with a grin. Sophie smiled. Good morning. He leaned on the counter. I think I need another one of your special coffees, she chuckled. Latte with cinnamon? Exactly. As Sophie prepared his drink, Daniel glanced at the menu. You know, I was thinking, you're learning English by working here, right? Sophie nodded. Yes, every day. Well, I work at a language school, he said. I teach English to international students. If you ever want help, I'd be happy to give you some tips. Sophie paused, surprised. An English teacher? Here, in my cafe? She turned back to him, her hands still holding the cinnamon shaker. You teach English? Yep. He smiled. And you're already learning fast. Sophie felt a spark of excitement. Maybe this was her chance to improve even more. As she handed him his latte, she grinned. Then, maybe you can teach me more words? Daniel raised his cup. Deal. And just like that, Sophie had made her first real connection through English, one that might help her in ways she hadn't imagined. Over the next few days, Daniel became a regular at Sophie's place. Every morning, he arrived at the cafe, ordered his special coffee, and chatted with Sophie as she worked. At first, their conversations were simple, just small. Talk about the weather, the cafe, or the best pastries on the menu. But as the days passed, Daniel started introducing new words and phrases naturally into their chats, gently correcting Sophie's mistakes when necessary. One morning, as Sophie wiped down the counter, Daniel leaned forward with a curious smile. So, Sophie, tell me, why did you decide to open this cafe? Sophie thought for a moment. She knew what she wanted to say, but forming the sentence in English was a challenge. I like coffee, she started slowly. And I like people. I want, she hesitated, searching for the right words. Daniel waited patiently. You want to? Sophie sighed, frustrated. I want a place where people feel good. Daniel nodded encouragingly. Ah, you want to create a welcoming place? Yes. Sophie's eyes lit up. Welcoming. A welcoming place. Daniel grinned. That's a great reason to open a cafe. Sophie felt a small thrill of victory. She had learned a new word, welcoming, and it was exactly what she meant. As she prepared Daniel's coffee, another customer entered the cafe. A woman with a large suitcase struggled to balance her phone and her bag as she approached the counter. Hi, do you have any strong coffee? I really need to wake up, she said with a tired smile. Sophie hesitated. Strong coffee? She knew coffee, but strong? She glanced at Daniel, who nodded slightly as if encouraging her to try. Sophie thought for a moment, then smiled. Yes, espresso. It is very strong, the woman laughed. Perfect, I'll take one. Relieved, Sophie prepared the espresso and handed it to the woman, who took a sip and sighed happily. This is exactly what I needed. Thank you, Sophie beamed. Another successful interaction. She turned back to Daniel, who gave her an approving look. See? You're learning fast, he said. And you explained it perfectly. Sophie wiped her hands on her apron.
Strong coffee means espresso?
Daniel nodded. Yes, espresso is very strong. But people also say bold coffee or dark roast. Sophie repeated the words, committing them to memory. Strong coffee, bold coffee, dark roast. Daniel smiled. Exactly. Their lessons continued like this every day. Daniel would introduce a word. Sophie would practice using it, and little by little her confidence grew. One afternoon, as the cafe started to quiet down, Sophie noticed Daniel flipping through a book while sipping his latte. Curious, she leaned over the counter. What are you reading? She asked carefully. Daniel looked up. Oh, it's just a book about languages. Sophie tilted her head. Languages? Yeah, I love learning languages, Daniel said. I speak a little Spanish, some French, and I'm trying to learn Japanese. Sophie's eyes widened. You learn different languages? He nodded. Yep, just like you're learning English. Sophie hesitated, then smiled. Then, maybe one day I'd teach you my language? Daniel laughed. That sounds like a fair deal. Sophie felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had started this cafe nervous about speaking English, afraid of making mistakes. But now, she had a friend, a teacher, who was helping her grow every day. And for the first time, she truly believed that she could do this. The next morning, Sophie arrived at the cafe feeling more confident than ever. Her conversations with customers were getting smoother, and Daniel's lessons were making a real difference. She had even started greeting people without hesitation. Good morning. What would you like? It felt natural now, not forced. And every time she successfully completed an order in English, she felt a little victory. But confidence could be tricky sometimes. It made her forget to slow down and think. Around midday, the cafe was buzzing with customers. Sophie moved quickly behind the counter, making drinks, taking orders, and greeting people with a bright smile. Then a man in a business suit stepped up. He looked at the menu for a moment before speaking. "I'll have a large black coffee, please." "No sugar, no milk." Sophie nodded, already reaching for a cup. "Yes." "You want a big dark coffee?" The man hesitated, then chuckled. I guess you could say that." Sophie frowned. Had she said something wrong? She glanced at Daniel, who had just walked in and overheard. He smiled but didn't say anything yet. She handed the man his coffee, and he thanked her before heading to a table, but the little chuckle stuck in her mind. When the cafe quieted down, Sophie turned to Daniel. "Why?" He laughed. Daniel grinned. "Because in English we don't usually say big dark coffee. We say large black coffee or just black coffee." Sophie blinked. "Oh, black coffee, not dark?" "Right. Dark is usually used for the type of coffee beans, like dark roast, but when ordering, people say black coffee." Sophie nodded, repeating it to herself. Large black coffee. Black. Difference. She had even started greeting people without hesitation. "Good morning. What would you like?" It felt natural now, not forced. And every time she successfully completed an order in English, she felt a little victory. But confidence could be tricky sometimes. It made her forget to slow down and think. Around midday, the cafe was buzzing with customers. Sophie moved quickly behind the counter, making drinks, taking orders, and greeting people with a bright smile. Then a man in a business suit stepped up. He looked at the menu for a moment before speaking. "I'll have a large black coffee, please." "No sugar, no milk." Sophie nodded, already reaching for a cup. "Yes." "You want a big dark coffee?" The man hesitated, then chuckled. I guess you could say that." Sophie frowned. Had she said something wrong? She glanced at Daniel, who had just walked in and overheard. He smiled but didn't say anything yet. She handed the man his coffee, and he thanked her before heading to a table, but the little chuckle stuck in her mind. When the cafe quieted down, Sophie turned to Daniel. "Why?" He laughed. Daniel grinned. "Because in English we don't usually say big dark coffee. We say large black coffee or just black coffee." Sophie blinked. "Oh, black coffee, not dark?" "Right. Dark is usually used for the type of coffee beans, like dark roast. But when ordering, people say black coffee." Sophie nodded, repeating it to herself. Large black coffee. Black coffee. Daniel gave her an encouraging nod. "But don't worry, he understood you. That's what matters." Sophie sighed, feeling a little embarrassed. "I want to speak perfect." Daniel shook his head. "No one speaks perfectly all the time. Even native speakers make mistakes." She raised an eyebrow. "You make mistakes?" Daniel laughed. "Oh, all the time. When I was learning Spanish, I once told someone I was very pregnant instead of very embarrassed." Sophie's eyes widened. Then she burst out laughing. "No." Oh, yes, Daniel said with a chuckle. They were very confused. Sophie covered her mouth, still laughing. Maybe mistakes weren't so bad after all. Just then, the bell jingled and another customer walked in. A woman in a bright yellow scarf approached the counter. "Hi there. I'd love a cappuccino, please." Sophie smiled, feeling ready. "Yes." "One cappuccino." The woman hesitated, then added, "Oh, and can you make it with almond milk?" Sophie's confidence wavered. Almond milk? She knew milk, but almond? She quickly glanced at Daniel, who made a subtle motion toward the shelf behind her. She turned and saw the cartons labeled almond milk. Relief flooded her. "Yes." She grabbed the carton and showed it to the woman. "Almond milk?" The woman smiled. "Yes, thank you." As Sophie prepared the drink, she felt a little thrill. She hadn't known the word almond, but she had figured it out using context. She handed the cappuccino to the woman, who took a sip and gave an approving nod. "This is great." "Thanks so much." Sophie felt a swell of pride. Even when she didn't know a word, she could still communicate. Daniel leaned on the counter with a smirk. "See? You're doing great." Sophie wiped her hands on her apron. "I learn every day." Daniel lifted his coffee, and that's all that matters. As she looked around her cozy cafe, filled with the hum of conversation and the rich scent of coffee, Sophie realized something. Mistakes weren't failures. They were just steps on the path to getting better, and she was ready to keep going. Sophie's confidence continued to grow with each passing day. The small mistakes were becoming fewer, and her conversations were becoming more fluid. It was a slow process, but she was starting to feel like she truly belonged in the world of English speakers. One chilly morning, as she was setting up the cafe for the day, Daniel walked in with a warm smile and a thoughtful expression. "Morning, Sophie," he greeted. "Good morning." Sophie replied, her voice upbeat as she wiped down the counter. Daniel ordered his usual latte, but this time he didn't just take a seat right away. Instead, he leaned on the counter and looked at her thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about something." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "I think it's time to challenge you a little more," Daniel said with a teasing smile. "You've got the basics down, but how do you feel about expressing your feelings in English?" Sophie blinked. "Feelings?" "Yeah, emotions, like when you're happy or upset or excited, or even when you want to ask for something." He paused, studying her face. "It's a different kind of English, you know? Not just coffee orders, but how we talk about life." Sophie felt a little nervous. She had never really thought about expressing emotions in English before. I don't know," Sophie admitted, rubbing her hands together nervously. "It sounds difficult." Daniel smiled gently. "Don't worry. It's all part of the journey. Just take it one step at a time. For example, tell me about your day yesterday. How was it?" Sophie thought for a moment, the words swirling in her head. She had learned a lot of new vocabulary in the past few days, but how could she use it all in a sentence that felt natural? She took a deep breath. Yesterday was good. She hesitated. I was happy because I helped a customer and I learned new words. Daniel nodded encouragingly. Great. You said you were happy, but can you describe that feeling more? Like, were you really happy or just a little happy? Sophie frowned, thinking. I was very happy, she said slowly. I felt good, like proud. Daniel smiled. Exactly. Proud is a great word to use. So let's try this. I was very happy because I helped a customer and learned new words. How does that feel? Sophie repeated the sentence. I was very happy because I helped a customer and learned new words. It felt good, but also a little scary. Expressing emotions in another language was a challenge. Daniel gave her a nod of approval. Now, let's try something else. What about when you're upset? How do you say that in English? Sophie's mind raced. Upset. She had heard the word before, but could she use it? I was upset when. She paused. When my coffee machine broke last week, it was frustrating. Daniel laughed softly. Perfect. You're learning how to explain your feelings, Sophie. It's all part of the process. Sophie felt a sense of accomplishment, though a little unsure. Was she really getting it? She decided to keep pushing forward. You know, Daniel continued, this is a huge part of communication. Not just ordering food or drinks, but talking about your experiences and emotions. It's what makes language truly alive. Sophie smiled. It feels more real, like I'm not just learning words, but actually living in English. That's exactly it, Daniel said, his eyes twinkling. When you speak English like this, it's like you're creating stories. You're not just learning the language, you're using it to tell your own story. Sophie felt a wave of realization. This was bigger than just learning a language. It was about connecting with people, understanding life in a deeper way, and expressing herself fully. Just then, the bell rang as another customer walked in. A young man with a backpack approached the counter. Hi. I'll have a cappuccino, please, he said, his voice friendly. Sophie smiled, instinctively moving to make his drink. Yes. Cappuccino, one moment. As she worked, she felt Daniel watching her. It wasn't pressure, just encouragement. She had grown so much in the last few weeks, and she was beginning to feel comfortable in her role. When the cappuccino was ready, she handed it to the customer. Here is your cappuccino. Have a nice day. The man smiled. Thanks, you too. Sophie's heart swelled as she watched him leave. She was doing it. She was speaking English, not just for orders, but for real conversations. Daniel leaned over the counter again, grinning. I told you you'd get there. Now, how do you feel? Sophie turned to him, her face glowing with confidence. I feel like I'm really doing it. Daniel nodded proudly. You're not just speaking English, you're living it. That's the heart of it. Sophie smiled. She had come a long way, and there was still so much more to learn. But for the first time, she knew something for sure. She wasn't just a cafe worker learning English. She was someone who had found her voice in another language, and it was hers to keep. It was a quiet morning at Sophie's place. The soft hum of the espresso machine filled the air, and the warmth of the cafe created a cozy atmosphere. Sophie stood behind the counter, ready for another day of learning and connection. Her journey with English had transformed from a struggle into an exciting adventure, and today she was more confident than ever. As she arranged the pastries on the display shelf, she glanced at the clock. The cafe would soon fill with familiar faces, the regulars who came for their coffee, the newcomers who were drawn in by the scent of freshly brewed espresso, and the curious tourists who wandered in for a taste of the neighborhood. But Sophie felt something different today, a sense of calm. She wasn't worried about her accent, her grammar, or her vocabulary. She knew mistakes would come, but they weren't something to fear anymore. They were part of the journey. Daniel arrived as he always did, with his warm smile and easy confidence. He ordered his latte, then took a seat by the window with his book. Sophie watched him for a moment, appreciating how much he had helped her along the way. It wasn't just about learning English anymore. It was about the connection they had built, the way they shared stories and laughed together. Daniel wasn't just a teacher. He was a friend, a mentor, someone who believed in her when she wasn't sure she believed in herself. "Good morning," Sophie called, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning," Daniel replied, lifting his mug in greeting. "I have a question for you," Sophie said, her curiosity piqued. "Shoot," Daniel said, setting his book aside. "How did you get so good at learning languages?" Sophie asked, moving closer to the counter. "I mean, you speak so many." Daniel smiled thoughtfully. "Well, it's not easy, that's for sure. But the secret is simple. You have to be patient with yourself. You can't rush it. And you have to really want to understand the language, not just learn the words." Sophie nodded, absorbing his words. She realized that this was the key to her own progress: patience, persistence, and a genuine desire to connect. "I've made so many mistakes along the way," Daniel continued, "but I've learned something important with each one. If you're not making mistakes, you're not trying hard enough." Sophie smiled. That sounded like something she could live by. Just then, the door opened and a new customer walked in. She was an older woman with gray hair tied in a bun and a warm smile. Sophie quickly greeted her. "Good morning. How can I help you?" The woman looked up at the menu, then back at Sophie. "I'll have a black coffee, please. No sugar, no cream." Sophie nodded. "Coming right up." As she prepared the coffee, Sophie couldn't help but feel proud of how far she had come. A year ago, she would have been nervous to take an order like that. But now it felt effortless. She wasn't just making coffee. She was engaging with people, sharing a small moment of connection with each customer who walked through the door. When she handed the woman her coffee, the customer smiled. "Thank you, dear." "You're welcome," Sophie replied, feeling a sense of accomplishment in her words. As the day went on, Sophie continued to serve coffee, chat with customers, and practice English. Each interaction, no matter how small, was a step forward. And though she still had a long way to go, Sophie felt a deep sense of pride in her progress. Later that afternoon, as the cafe began to quiet down, Daniel stood up to leave. He waved to Sophie with a smile. "See you tomorrow?" Sophie smiled back. "Of course. I'll be here." As he walked out the door, Sophie felt a wave of gratitude. She knew that her journey with English wasn't over. There would always be new words to learn, new expressions to master, and new challenges to face. But the most important thing was this: she was no longer afraid. She had started this journey with the fear of speaking, the fear of making mistakes. But now she understood something profound. It wasn't about speaking perfectly, it was about speaking at all. And as she looked around her cafe, filled with the laughter of customers and the warm smell of coffee, Sophie knew one thing for sure. She had found her place in the world of language, and she was ready to keep going. Because, as Daniel had taught her, the journey wasn't just about learning words. It was about living those words. And she was doing that, one conversation at a time,